here we go. Okay, so grade 12, we're going to be starting a new topic, diversity, continuity, and change, evolution. Okay, so what is evolution? What does it mean when we talk about evolution? To change, okay? And so, but that is what evolution is. Evolution is the ability to change based on environmental pressures, okay? So we have environmental pressures that exist. Those environmental pressures can range. It can be a predator that causes that environmental pressure. It can be changes in seasonal changes that causes that pressure. There's a stimulus that puts pressure on a population to then change in order to adapt to suit that specific environment. Okay? What happens if an animal cannot adapt or change? They die out. Okay? So if an animal doesn't have the ability to adapt to change, we obviously have the death of that specific animal. If it's the death of the entire population or the entire species, what is that called? Extinction. And so what we see is when we study evolution, we see periods of great change taking place, and then we see kind of leveling off. Things kind of, are cool and happy, and then we see great change. And those, in the times where things change, animals are able to adapt, they're able to evolve, they're able to meet the demand. So there's a specific environmental pressure or demand that gets put on a population that causes them to adapt. Those that can adapt, survive. Those that can't adapt, die out. And so we'll see lots of extinction, lots of evolution. Lots of extinction, lots of evolution. And so scientists have said that has been the driving force behind pushing species towards what we have now as what we call our pinnacle kind of species in humans. And we'll look at human evolution specifically. So we're going to first look at theories of evolution. What are some of the ideas behind evolution? Who came up with these theories? Why have they been accepted? Why have certain theories been rejected? Etc., etc. Okay, are we all happy with this concept? Okay, fantastic. So let's move on. So firstly, evolution is seen as a scientific theory, not only as a hypothesis. So let's first just talk about this concept of a theory. When we talk about a theory in science, it doesn't mean it's theoretical, like it's like an unknown that possibly could exist. That's not the scientific word for theory. The scientific word that we call a theory is something that has already been substantiated. There is proof, there is evidence, and it has been accepted by the scientific community. Does that make sense? It's like the theory of the atom, okay? So we don't necessarily know what the atom looks like, okay, but we have a fairly good idea because atoms behave in a particular way, atoms behave in a particular way, so they've come up with the theory, okay, or the atomic theory. Are we all happy with that? It's not theoretical like, I want to, theoretically I'd like to one day go to the moon. It's not that. So when we talk about something being a theory in science, it's actually not a kind of questionable thing, it's already an established thing. Okay, how did we get to that establishment? By coming up with hypotheses. So there's a hypothesis that gets laid down. Well, where did life begin? How did life begin? Could it have begun like this? Could it have begun like that? And we look at all sorts of different fields of study that have contributed to the ideas. And then this one proves X, this one proves Y, this one proves Z. Because we've got X, Y, and Z, we can say this is the law or the theory now. And that theory is proven because we have accepted certain hypotheses. If a hypothesis is accepted over and over and over again, it then substantiates that the theory is true. Is everybody happy with that concept? So we start out by just kind of substantiating, kind of laying the platform that evolution is not a questionable thing. This is something that does happen. Okay? We'll talk about personal views, or we'll talk about my views at a later point, but let's just go through it. Okay? Right, the theory is based on a wide range of hypotheses that have been tested and verified over time. Let's distinguish between a hypothesis and a theory. A hypothesis is often called an informed assumption. It's basically a prediction. So we have a hypothesis, and then we test that hypothesis, and if that hypothesis is accepted, then it is kind of established that, when you throw something in the air, gravity, the force of gravity exists, and it's going to pull that particular thing down. We hypothesize it first, and then we come up with a theory of gravity, and now we have the law of gravity. So So it's almost like the progression of science is to have hypothesis. Hypothesis comes from questions. How does this work? Why does this work? Where does it work? When, etc., etc. So we have questions that arise from the observable world. We come up with a prediction based on what we see. If that prediction is then substantiated or approved, so it's yes, 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 this hypothesis is accepted, that hypothesis then becomes a theory, and ultimately that theory will become a law. Okay? So there are certain laws in science that are almost non-negotiable. The law of gravity, it's a non-negotiable. Okay? You can't question it. It's not in that phase. Are we all happy with that? Right, so where are we? A hypothesis is tested on a series of experiments or by repeated observations. Depending on the results, it is either rejected or it is accepted. A theory is a well-substantiated scientific explanation of events, which is supported by evidence. Same results obtained via research, investigations, studies that make sense of natural phenomena. So we look at the natural world around us, and we basically substantiate that this is the case. It is based on evidence. It is usually tested and confirmed by independent groups of researchers, so it should be substantiated by more than just one party and by more than just one field of science. And so we're going to look at the various fields of science that have contributed towards the theory of evolution. Okay, and then it gets it develops and can change when we have new evidence. So that's the thing about a theory. It does have the ability to kind of mold it or change depending on new evidence that comes up. So things do change, unlike a law. A law is kind of almost unchangeable. Okay, are we all happy with the difference between a hypothesis and a theory? Can I move on? All right. So evidence and theories. Scientists have obtained a body of knowledge that has been obtained through inquiry, discovery, describing, and explaining. So we have to have inquiry, questions come up, discovery, observing, looking, testing, etc. Describe what it is we see, what we have in front of us, and then explaining those things. During discovery inquiry, observations are made, data and facts are collected and recorded, and then they are analyzed. Based on what is seen, scientists come up with generalizations. Using a microscope, scientists generalize that all living organisms are made out of cells. This is called inductive reasoning. So because we've studied all living organisms, we see that they are cells. It's called a generalization. We can induce that all living organisms are made out of cells. Has every single living organism on the planet been studied? No, right? There's some living organisms that we are still, to this day, discovering. We haven't even looked at them under a microscope, right? But because we can classify, or we can generalize that if you are living, you must be made out of a cell. If I see something that is living, you are definitely made of a cell, even though I haven't necessarily studied. That's called a generalization, and it's called inductive reasoning. I can induce that. You're a living organism, therefore you must be made of cells. Have I personally gone and looked at Grace's cells under a microscope to see that she is made of cells? I haven't. Yet, because she's a living organism, and I understand that all living organisms are made of cells, you must be made up of cells. It's called inductive reasoning. Okay, you can induce a particular generalization. Okay, they put together investigations to test whether the possible explanations are correct or not. This is called hypothesis testing. So we have evidence for various theories of evolution. I'm going to move on from this. Okay, so we have inductive and deductive reasoning, right? So during hypothesis testing, deductive reasoning is used. The generalization is used to predict a specific result. So as I said to you here, all living organisms are made of cells. Humans are living organisms. Those are both generalizations, right? They are both deductive reasoning. What can we induce from that? So we can say all living organisms are made of cells. Humans are living organisms. What can we deduce? We can say humans are made of cells. So if you know what I mean? So that's how they kind of come up with these ideas of inductive and deductive reasoning. Right. Investigations using the experimental format are designed to test if the hypothesis is accepted or rejected, the data is collected, etc., etc. So I'm going to just move on from this concept. Okay? Right. Okay, things we have already discussed throughout our field of study in life sciences. In grade 10 and 11, we spoke about biodiversity, okay? And so in grade 11 specifically, we spoke about how there is a progressive nature of things becoming more complex. So we have a unicellular protist, for example. Well, actually, let's go back all the way to bacteria. So we have bacteria, and then evolution has taken place to bring about protists. Protists have then become a fungi-like, a plant-like, an animal-like protist, and then those have all evolved into the branch of Plantae, fungi, and Animalia. Okay? And diversity exists. So we've already discussed that. We've shown how classification and evolution are linked. We've spoken about fossils and biogeography, evidence of that in our grade 10 content. We did the history of the life on Earth. We spoke about when life kind of began 4.6 billion years ago. What was the first living organism, and all of that Cambrian. So remember the Precambrian explosion, and the Precambrian era. Then we had Cambrian explosion. We had the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. You know all of those? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. So that's all grade 10 stuff. Geological timescale, how life began, Oppenheimer hypothesis. All of these things have contributed to our understanding of evolution. So these are all things that we did in grade 10 and 11. It's information that you need to have a good foundation of, because we're now building on that foundation. Okay. If you don't have a good foundation of that, well, yeah, you'll have to just figure it out. It'll be fun. Right, so population and species, guys, we already know what a population and a species is. This becomes quite important to understand, because through evolution, we have the rise of new species, okay? So as one species evolves, then we have a new species becoming. Does that make sense? Okay? But if you don't have an understanding of what a species is, how do you define when this is actually a new species or not? Okay, what is the definition? So let's quickly look at that. A species is a group of organisms that have a large number of similar characteristics, and this is the thing here, are able to interbreed and to produce viable offspring that are fertile. So they must be able to produce babies that can make babies. Okay? Let's just quickly break that down in terms of our natural understanding. We know that a horse and a donkey are similar in terms of characteristics, right? They have similar behaviors, they have similar characteristics, they've got similar shape, blah, blah, blah. But if you mate a horse and a donkey, what do you get? You get a mule. And is a mule fertile? No, a mule is infertile. And so that is the point where, yes, they have similar characteristics, yes, they might share the same environment, yes, they might have a similar shape and all of that stuff, but they are unable to interbreed to produce viable, fertile offspring. And so it's at that point that we say, okay, cool, this is now a new species. Yes, Tati?
Ma'am, so like for example with the horse and the donkey,
Yes.
they have like the same number of chromosomes, and that's why they can like have a baby, if that makes sense.
I honestly have no idea how many chromosomes a horse and a donkey have. So we'd have to Google how many chromosomes they have. I don't have my phone's busy recording, so I can't.
Ma'am, wouldn't you like have to have the same number of chromosomes in each of them, if that makes sense too?
I mean, for me personally, it makes sense, but I can't 100% substantiate that that is true. So let me see if I can Google it quickly, and then we'll move on while we Google. Make sense? Okay, so we've got species, we're happy with that. Population. What is a population now? This is also important because when we look at speciation taking place, it happens through populations. Okay, and we'll talk about it. So it's just important to know what a population is. A population is a group of individuals of the same species occupying the same habitat at the same time, having the ability to interbreed. So yes, they are able to interbreed, but they also occupy the same space, the same environment at the same time. So that they can have interaction. If by chance they get separated by something, then those two populations are isolated, and then potentially evolution can happen to each population individually, ultimately changing that population into a new species. If they change enough, it will be classified as a new species. If they come back and they can still interbreed, they're not classified as a new species, they then become the same population.
Is that like with the humans, if that makes sense? Because like when we were like far apart, we started to look different, but we were still the same species.
Yes, yeah, so we're still the same species. So yes, you might have somebody from China looking very different to somebody from Africa, okay? But if an African person marries a Chinese person, can they make babies? That make babies? Yes. So we're still part of the same species. Yes, we have different features, slightly different. We've all become slightly unique to fulfill a specific purpose. There's variation. Now, variation is a driving force for evolution. Okay, and why is variation such a driving force? It's because we are different. Because you have different strengths, and I have different strengths, and you have different positives, and I have different positives. If something changes in our environment, because of variation, if I have a particular strength that allows me to succeed, and you don't have that strength, that forces evolution to take place. You're going to die, I'm going to live. Does that make sense? What is that process called? Anybody know?
Adaptation?
Not quite adaptation. Let's use the kind of colloquial, or the kind of normal way of me speaking. So, okay? Survival of the fittest. Have you heard of survival of the fittest? Okay? Those that are the strongest are able to survive. That is actually a very good way to compare what actually happens in evolution. So in evolution we have something called natural selection. I have no idea if this is coming up on the board. Selection. Okay. We have natural selection. Is it fine? Maybe not. Is it okay? Okay, anyway. I think the lights and it's difficult.
But I'm sure I can hear that man is saying natural selection.
Yeah. I think everyone can hear everything I say. I always feel like I'm shouting on these things because I've got to go past the screen, and I've also got to make sure I talk to the person at the back. So when I'm recording in class, I just feel like I'm shouting. And I'm like, shame, these poor children are just getting shouted at all the time. When I don't have the screen and I'm just recording without it being at a class, then it sounds normal, then it's fine. So I feel terrible. If you watch videos and I'm shouting, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm sorry for you guys. Yes.
I was going to say, like, it does sound different when the teachers have the thing on and
Yeah.
like it changes their voices. But obviously you can't help it because that's the...
This is how it has to be. I feel like I'm in a box and I'm just stuck here. But anyway. Right, so natural selection is survival of the fittest. Is fittest with a double T? Probably, huh? See, this is the awkwardness of like the pressure of being on things. Like, what happens if someone sees that I'm a moron and I'm actually supposed to be the teacher? Anyway, so it's survival of the fittest. In other words, if you have a characteristic that allows you to succeed, you are then able to pass on your successful strength to the next generation. Ultimately, that then will be a stronger kind of individual, and that gets passed on. The strongest survive, the weakest die. Okay? Those that can survive, those that are able to adapt, those that are able to change according to the environmental pressures are able to survive and pass on their genes. If they cannot adapt or change to the environmental pressures, they ultimately are going to die and become extinct. Okay, and so there's two things in evolution: death or evolve. You either become extinct or you evolve and you change. Currently, polar bears are under a huge amount of pressure because of climate change. So there's an environmental change existing on putting a pressure because of climate change, causing the polar ice caps to melt. Polar bears are either going to adapt or they are going to become extinct. That is the natural progression of evolution. Unfortunately, evolution or animals don't have sufficient time to adapt at the rate at which climate change and human impact is forcing those environmental pressures. So those environmental pressures are coming up more quickly, more rapidly because of human impact. So we are contributing to this at a much higher rate, and therefore extinction is accelerated. Animals can't adapt fast enough to the amount of pressure that we're putting on them. Okay, because we're adding not necessarily a natural pressure, we're adding kind of man-made pressure that's forcing animals to basically become extinct because they can't adapt fast enough. You know, when you've got years to adapt, then animals are able to change over time, but if they're not able to change over time, they become extinct. Okay. Right, let's quickly talk about variation. As I said to you, grade 12s, variation is the driving force behind evolution. Because we are different, okay, we have the ability to compete, so there is competition that exists, and when an individual has an adaptation that allows them to outcompete another one, they have what we call natural selection. You are naturally selected to succeed in this environment. Put me in another environment, maybe not so great. I might have to adapt. Change the environment, maybe not so great. I might have to adapt. If I can't adapt, extinct. Okay, and so I'm just trying to show you that illustration of variation leads to natural selection. If you can't be naturally selected, you ultimately are going to become extinct. Right, so where do we see variation? So individuals in a species are not identical due to crossing over and random assortment of chromosomes during meiosis. So here you can see we did this topic at the beginning of the year, kind of the March-ish. If anybody remembers that we had March, like, you know, it just feels like everything's just a blur. COVID 2020, yeah. Anyway, for those that are watching this in like 2025, one day when my YouTube videos are still going crazy, because you know I'm such a good teacher. Anyway, in 2020 we didn't know that March existed because it was just such a hectic year. Anyway, so we did meiosis, yes. Okay, so we're going to recap. We have to have an understanding of meiosis. We understand this process of crossing over. Just quickly, let's recap. What phase of meiosis does crossing over take place? In prophase 1, right? Prophase 1. And remember, if you just say prophase, are you talking about meiosis? Are you talking about meiosis? No, you're then talking about mitosis. Okay. So in prophase 1, random assortment. Where does random assortment happen, guys? Or actually, remember, we didn't say assortment anymore. What do we use? Arrangement. Okay? Please, guys, it's not random assortment. It's random, and it is random. That's a very big word. This random thing is fundamental. So, because you can't force it. It happens randomly. Nobody has the ability to control evolution. Okay? So we have random arrangement. In what phase of meiosis does random arrangement take place? In metaphase 1. Agreed? Metaphase 1, and then they are randomly segregated. You're all happy with that? And so after random assortment, we have segregation of those homologous chromosomes in anaphase 1. Yes? Okay. So we got that. Chance fertilization of egg and sperm during reproduction, that produces variation. What does that mean? During fertilization or during sexual intercourse, there is a huge number of spermatozoa that are being produced. Millions of sperm cells are produced in every ejaculation. What are the chances that that sperm cell and that egg cell actually fuse? That brings variation. You're never going to have that again. So through variation, that then brings about an individual that is unique and has its specific adaptations, allowing it to either outcompete or not compete, causing death. Okay, everybody cool? Right, so chance, do you understand this concept of chance fertilization? Okay, so the chance fertilization of that specific egg and that sperm cell brings about variation. You're never going to have that again. Also because every sperm cell and every egg cell is different. Okay, so it really brings about this huge amount of variation. And then the last one, which we spoke about at the end of genetics, mutations. Okay, mutations can take place. Those mutations can either be positive or they can be negative. Okay, so you can have an advantageous mutation or you can have a disadvantageous mutation or whatever. A good one or a bad one. Okay, so you can have a mutation that brings about the ability to adapt to your environment more successfully, and you can have a mutation that causes you to not be able to compete. Okay, and that happens during DNA replication. Okay. There can be mistakes. Remember we spoke about point mutations, substitution, and inversion. Okay, so you can substitute a base, or we can invert a base, or we can have what we call frame shift mutation. So frame shift, we have insertion, shifting the whole DNA sequence down, or we can have deletion, shifting the whole DNA sequence up. And through those mutations, that can bring change and variation. Okay, variation drives evolution. Because we are different, we can outcompete or we can compete with each other. Those that have an advantageous mutation, those that are better suited for their environment, will outcompete those that are not. Those that are not will die, those that are will live and drive evolution forward towards the pinnacle species. At that point, the pinnacle species can change. What will cause a pinnacle species to change? Yes, external pressure. Okay, so we can have an external change that would then put an environmental pressure on that specific species, like why did the dinosaurs become extinct? So those are things that kind of, the dinosaurs were unable to adapt to whatever that environmental change was, whether it was volcanoes or a meteor erupting or whether it was continental drift. They were unable to adapt and they became extinct. Okay. Right, so we're going to look at 5 fields of study that contribute to evolution. Comparative anatomy, which is called homology, we'll talk about it later. Biogeography, genetics and embryology, they all indicate that species may differ, but specific features indicate that they have a common ancestor. And so for now, I'm going to just stop the video, and we'll come back in 2 minutes. Okay, everybody happy? Cool. I don't want the videos to be too long.